Have you ever been really impressed by one of your friends? Not by like something cool that they can do, like box jump really high or like bench press a whole bunch of weight or I don't know, stuff like that. But like you've been impressed by maybe who they are or like how they have treated you. Not too long ago, I had a friend that said he wanted to come down and visit me. And I was a bit worried when he said this because he lives like 2 hours away. And so when he said, I want to come down and visit with you and talk with you, I got a little nervous, right? I was like, okay, what does this mean? How's this going to play out? Why does he want to come see me? So I started thinking of like all the things that he could want to talk about, right? Maybe he was having problems with his marriage. Maybe he lost his job, right? Maybe he had done something wrong. Maybe he had killed somebody and the body was in the trunk of his car. That wasn't the case. Maybe he had some type of illness. I didn't know. I started running through all these things about what was wrong and why he wanted to come and talk with me. And so he came down and he took me out to lunch, and we're at lunch. And finally, I'm just like, at this point, we've been together for like 30 minutes, almost an hour, hanging out. And I looked at him, and across the side, I just looked him in the eyes and said, all right, like, why are you here? What do you need to talk about? What do we need to talk about? And he looked back at me and said, nothing. I just wanted to come and visit with you and check on you and see how you're doing. And I was shocked a little bit because I thought, well, here I am thinking like he's got some type of problem and he's going to come to me and I'm going to help him. And it was actually the opposite, because at some level he saw something in me that said, I want to go and see him and talk to him. And we had a great conversation, but I want you to think about this for a second, because he had no agenda other than to come and to check on me and to talk with me. So think about this for a second. When was the last time that you checked in on someone else, right? When was the last time that you checked in on somebody because you saw something in them and you said, man, I need to talk to them. I need to see how they're doing. I need to visit with them a little bit. Not because you have an agenda, but because you care about them. Can you think of that time? My guess is this, is that for many of us in this room, we don't do that very well. There's probably some of us in here that do this from time to time. We really do check in with our friends, the people that we care about, and see how they're doing. But for many of us, we just assume everything is good, and we don't really ask the hard questions and dive a whole lot into that. This is going to be our conversation for today, what it looks like to check in on your friends. As we've been going through this series, so far we've talked about these ideas. I'm going to put these up there. We talked about perception, right? We looked at the parable of the tax collector, right, as he was praying, and this idea of how you perceive people, how you see people is important. It's important to Jesus. And so our challenge was that we should see people like Christ sees people. And so our perception of others is important to everything else that we talk about. We talked about inclusion as we looked at what James talked about favoritism and what it looks like for us. Now, all of us do this very well, but we need to include others in what we do and in our groups and our friends. We should have this level of inclusion as Christians. And then a few weeks ago, Jarrett talked to us about compassion when we looked at the story of the Good Samaritan and how that everyone is made in the image of God. And so when we see people are hurting or in need, we should have compassion on them. And tonight, I want to add our fourth one to the list. It's looking after. What it means to look after your friends and to check in on them and be there for them. Our text is going to come from James again this week, and it's just one verse, and so I'm going to make it really easy for you. It's James 1:27, and as James writes to the early church, these new believers, you can go put on there, this is what he says to them. He says, religion that our God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Just one verse, just one simple verse, but it's important because it has implications for how we live and how we treat people. The very first part of this verse says this, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. We have to understand this to understand how the rest of it goes. Religion, when we say that word in our culture today doesn't have a great connotation, right? In fact, even back when James wrote this, it didn't have this great connotation either, because many times religion and politics were very tied together, okay? It's not a whole lot different today, but back then it was even closer tied together. In fact, early Christians, the people who very first followed Jesus, they were viewed as having a political stance. Like Christianity was very much viewed as this a political way because they would view Jesus as their king, and that was their sole allegiance. And so they often had this battle between Caesar and Jesus and all this type of stuff. And so when James brings this up, it says, religion that God our Father accepts, and he describes it as pure and faultless. What he's trying to do is differentiate between religion and politics. Because those two words, pure and faultless, are never the words that you would describe in politics, right? And so he's trying to separate these two ideas. And so, what makes your personal religion acceptable to God? What would keep it from being polluted by the world? So this is what he says. It's right here in front of you. He says to look after orphans and widows in their distress. This word is going to be the focus of what we talk about. So I want you to pay attention for just a minute. To look after, in the Greek, is this word, I'm going to say it correctly, episkeptomahi. Okay, it means to look upon, to visit, to look out, select, and its definitions are in order to see how he is, to visit, to go see one, to look upon in order to help or to benefit. So, one Greek word, and it's translated into English as to look after, but this is really what it means. And I love the depth of this word in English because to look after also means to go visit, to go see them, to check in on them. And that's exactly what my friend did for me. When he came and saw me, he came to visit, he came to check in on me, he came to see how I was doing, right? Face to face. And so I wonder if you can be that type of person. Can you be that type of person that cares about people enough that you would go see how they are? You would go visit them in order to help them or to benefit them because you care about them. So what I have for you tonight is two ideas, and these are very simple, but I think if we can wrap our minds around this definition, this idea, you'll understand what it means and what it looks like to look after people and to care about them in that way. So here's the first one. To look after, we look after others by seeing their needs, okay? Here's what it says. I see this in the text. He says this, to look after widows and orphans in what? In their distress. All right, so when James writes this, orphans and widows, when a father or a husband would pass away, they had no rights, right? They had no one to care for them. It was a completely different world than what we live in right now. Women typically didn't have a way of income, especially children, obviously. And so when the father or the husband would pass away and we'd create a widow and orphans, they would be left alone. Oftentimes they would pass away, or what was beginning to happen was the church would start to take care of them. And so this is the context of what we find. They would face a life of tribulation because they would struggle. And so I wonder how many times your friends or the people around you in your life would have needs, not just physical needs, okay? Let's put that to the side for a second, but like emotional or spiritual needs. And we're not paying attention to those things, and we're not noticing. I think the older that you get, the more that you could pick up on this a little bit easier. You can, it's not guaranteed. But right now in your life, sometimes you can be so focused on yourself that you don't notice the other things that people are going through. Let me give you some examples of what this could look like in your life. Maybe you're a freshman, and you're gonna be a freshman this year, and what's gonna happen to some of you, or maybe some of your friends, is that you're going to have someone who has played a sport or a club or an activity for as long as they can remember as a kid, and all of a sudden you're going to get into high school and you're going to try out for the team and you're not going to make it. That's going to happen to somebody. That's going to happen to one of your friends. And the older that you get, the more it gets more select and people are going to get cut. And sometimes your identity can be so wrapped up in that's hard to deal with. I've seen it before. And so there's some things going on there that can affect people. And so maybe instead of just, and I'm sorry that happened to you, maybe you look after them. You check in on them and see how they're doing and see how they're processing that on a deeper conversation. That's one example. Maybe at some point in high school, you or one of your friends is going to go through a traumatic family experience. Your parents will get divorced or may lose a grandparent. I know those are two different things, but you could go through a traumatic family experience, and those things are hard to deal with. they're difficult. And sometimes you have the support for them, sometimes you don't. I wonder if you can say more than, man, I'm sorry you're going through that. But you check in on them. You look after them. You connect with them on a deeper level and follow up. You visit with them. Maybe you're going to have a friend who starts making poor choices at some point throughout high school. And maybe they start drinking, or maybe they start fooling around with a boy or a girl, or whatever the case may be. And maybe they start making these poor choices. And instead of distancing yourself from them, which sometimes may be the right thing to do, but maybe instead of distancing yourself and saying, well, they're just making bad choices, or I don't really want to be friends with them anymore, you catch it early and you look after them. And you start asking questions and you check in on them and you are there for them even in their poor choices. These are all things that could happen to you or could happen to your friends. And sometimes we just don't pay attention enough to wonder, how are people actually doing on the inside? And that's something that I want us to pay attention to. When we aren't affected by these things because we feel like it's just life, like that's what people go through, we won't look after others and we won't see their needs because we're ignoring them. The beautiful thing is that Jesus modeled this for us. This isn't just one verse that James mentions and then we try to apply it across all levels of our life. Jesus talked about this and he modeled it for us. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew kind of sums it up a little bit as Matthew puts it like this. He says, Jesus went through all the towns and the villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. You see, not only did Jesus see the physical needs of people and actually do something about it, we see that over and over. Jesus feeds people and he heals people. He did something about their physical needs, but Jesus recognized our own spiritual need as well. And he saw that in the people that he interacted with, and he sees that in the future through us as well, of people who have a spiritual need. And we're reminded of the great gospel truth as Paul kind of sums it up in Romans chapter 5, verses 6 and 8. He says, you see, just at the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's the great truth of the gospel, is that Jesus saw this need in humanity. He saw in all of us that we were all dead to sin and helpless. We're all marred by sin and helpless to find the hope that we need. And that is why Jesus came. Yet Jesus sees our distress. He sees yours in two ways. I need you to understand and connect with this. He sees what you're going through. He knows what you deal with. He knows how you feel on the inside. And don't ever feel like God doesn't know what you go through. He does. He sees that, but he also sees more than that. He sees your real problem, sin, and the separation that happens because of sin between you and God. And that is where Jesus stepped in and took our place. That's why we praise him. That's why we worship him. But look what Jesus said at the end of that verse in Matthew. He says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. He wants us to go. He wants us to move our feet and to go do something. And that's what my friend did for me. He came and he visited me. He came and he talked to me. He saw something on some level where he said, man, something I said or something that I did or how I was behaving. He saw something and said, I need to go check in on him. So here's the second thing I want you to see, is that we look after others by going to them, right? You remember how I told you that word to look after in the original Greek means to visit, right? To go visit. So here's what I want you to think about. This is more than just sending a text, all right, on your phone. We often think of like if I were to say checking in on your friend, you think, well, okay, well, I'll send them a text and see how they're doing. We live in a culture that's like this, right? I'm like this. I'd much rather send and receive a text than answer the phone or like have a real conversation. Are you guys kind of like that? Like, I don't answer my phone if I don't recognize the phone number. I just go straight to my voicemail. Then, like, if you ever call me and you get my voicemail literally says, hey, this is Matt, send me a text, right? That's what my voicemail says. Because I just rather, it's easier to communicate that way. But one of the things that happens over text message is it's way less personal. And I could promise you that if my friend, his name's Tyler, if Tyler sent me a text that same day and said, "Hey Matt, how are you?" You know how I would have responded? "I'm good. How are you?" Right? It's not personal. It's easy to just respond that way. In fact, even in conversation, it's just easy to say, "I'm good. How are you?" Right? Even if you're not good. But what happened when he came and saw me, when he visited me, we sat at the lunch table and he looked at me, and when he said to me, "How are you doing?" Like, really, how are you doing? That hit different than a text message. And it gave me the permission to be honest and to open up and to share and to say, I'm glad you've asked. Here's some of the things I'm going through. Here's some of the things I'm struggling with. Because he has, and this is a different conversation, he has the permission to ask those questions in my life, right? He has that permission. I've given him that permission. But he noticed something that said, I need to visit. I need to check in on him. And to be honest, I needed that. I did. In that moment, in my season in my life where it was, I needed that. I needed someone in my corner asking me those questions. You need that too. But maybe you also need to be that to someone else. That's what I want you to think about. So I want you to think about this real quick as I wrap this up. Think about the story of Job. If you've been around church, you're probably familiar with Job's story. It's one of the oldest stories in the Bible. Like if you were to read a chronological version of the Bible, Job's story would happen very quickly, probably within your first 2 weeks of reading, because it's an old story. In fact, it was told orally for generations before it was written down. And Job was a man that was afflicted, had all this type of pain. He was a righteous man, but had all this type of pain and loss and destruction in his life. But Job had some friends who took notice of what happened to him. I just want to read you these verses, and I just want you to picture Job and his troubled nature, and this is what we read. It says, when Job's 3 friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, heard all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes, and they met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes and they sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. It's interesting because they went. They were there for him. And the very first thing they did was just be with him. They just sat, and eventually they would listen. I just want you to consider tonight this idea. What would it look like for you just to go to your friends? Just to go to them and to be there for them, see them in their distress and in their hurting, and just do those things. So let me give you 2 practical things. So if you've tuned out, here's what you could take away. Here's how you actually put this into practice. The 2 things are this. One is to take an inventory of the status of your friends. Okay? And I kind of wrote down this idea is like if you could write down like 10 friends, 10 people that are close to you. Maybe 10's too big of a number for some of you. You don't have that many friends, okay? But for some of you, maybe you have 10, and you could write down all 10 of their names. And then what I challenge you to do is like, can you write down next to their name what's going on in their life? Like what great things have happened to them? What bad things? Would you know like what is going on in their life? It's taking an inventory of them. Do you know what's going on? Would you even know if they were in distress, if they were struggling? And so just taking an inventory of them. And then with that list, here's what I would challenge you to do is to go visit someone. Not send a text, to go visit. Who needs talking to? Who needs a conversation? Who needs to be asked tough questions? And here's the thing that I want you to think about. I want to challenge you to actually do it. I know I could stand up here a lot of times and give you ideas and challenges. I want to challenge you to actually do this, to select and choose someone that you could go and visit. Maybe that's not very hard for you. You don't have to drive hours. It was like someone maybe they live really close to you, but to go and to be with them and to have a real conversation. And here's why I challenge you with that, because I'm asking you to start with your friends. Not what the text says. The text says to do this with widows and orphans, okay? Is to go visit them, to go be with them, to go check on them. I'm asking you to do that with your friends. To go visit, to check in on them, to ask tough questions, and to see how they are truly doing. I'm asking you to start small. This matters, I think, because this was the heartbeat of Jesus. This is what he cared about. In fact, this was the thriving purpose of the early church. If I had time, I would go through a couple different examples of the book of Acts and show you how they cared for people was the differential factor of how people viewed them. Of what the early church looked like is because they cared for people. They went and visited those who were hurting in need. They sold things to help people who were struggling. So what I want you to take away from this is that you look after others by not looking past their needs. If you remember one thing, it's this: you look after others by not looking past their needs. When we do this, I think that this room would begin to look differently. If you were just to do this in your small group, just the people that you're the closest to look after them, to have real conversations, your group would be different. When Tyler did this for me, it helped me. It really did. And I don't know how many people would feel like they have that permission to ask me, hey, how are you doing? And I would say, I'm doing good. And they would say, no, really, how are you doing? You have people like that in your life. You have friends like that in your life that you do have the permission, or you should, to say, how are you? I've noticed something. And to have a conversation and to see how you can help others. So let's give a visit to a friend in need.